Welcome to my channel.
The wind screamed around the chimney pots of Loch like a choir of banshees demanding overtime pay. It was the kind of December 23rd that made strong men weep and weak men contemplate moving to Bournemouth. Inside the police station, which was essentially the front room of his small cottage, Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his most vital police duty, trying desperately not to freeze to death. He was currently draped over his pot-bellied black stove like a damp tea towel, inhaling the faint, comforting aroma of burning peat and his own scorching woolen trousers. Hamish, a tall, gangling man with flaming red hair and eyes the colour of a decent single malt held up to the light, let out a long sigh that rivalled the wind outside. He hated Christmas. In Loch, Christmas did not mean roasting chestnuts by an open fire. It meant tourists sliding their expensive saloons into ditches, sheep getting stranded on crags, and an increase in domestic disputes brought on by too much whiskey and proximity to relatives one usually spent the year happily avoiding. His small, ginger mongrel, Lugs, was currently wedged under Hamish's chair, vibrating with a shared sense of existential dread. Lugs had a very low opinion of snow, especially the wet, slapping kind currently assaulting the village. Hamish's immediate problem, however, was not crime, but caffeine. He was out of milk. A black coffee was too austere for a morning like this. It required the civilizing influence of full-fat dairy. This meant braving the elements to walk the 100 yards to Patel's general store. He peeled himself off the stove, put on his greatcoat, which smelled faintly of wet dog and old soup, and jammed his peaked cap onto his head. "Right, Lugs. Duty calls, and my stomach is calling louder," he muttered. Lugs merely groaned and pressed his nose firmer into the rag rug. Hamish stepped outside and was immediately assaulted by a gust of sleet that felt personal. The village of Loch was hunkered down, the whitewashed cottages looking grey and sullen under the bruised sky. The mountains that ringed the loch were invisible, swallowed by a churning white mist. It was beautiful in a way that suggested nature wanted you dead, which was the essence of the Highland charm. He had just cleared the garden gate, his boots crunching on the icy gravel, when the peace, such as it was shattered. A vehicle roared around the bend by the harbour. It wasn't the rattling Land Rover of a local farmer. It was a gleaming silver Range Rover Vogue, spotless despite the weather, and it was taking the corner with an aggression suited to the M25, not a single-track Highland road. The behemoth skidded slightly, spraying slush over Hamish's trousers before mounting the grass verge opposite the police station and shuddering to a halt. Hamish stopped, blinking rain out of his eyes. He recognised the type immediately. A Sassenach on a mission to enjoy the wild ruggedness of Scotland, provided it came with underfloor heating and high-speed Wi-Fi. The driver's door flew open and a man emerged. He was large, florid, and wearing a brand-new Barber jacket that was still stiff with wax, and green Hunter Wellingtons that had clearly never encountered actual mud. "You there, officer!" the man boomed. His voice was loud, fruity, and echoed with the assumption that everyone else was slightly deaf and stupid. Hamish waited. He found that if you waited long enough, people usually kept talking and saved you the effort of thinking up a reply. The man marched over, ignoring the sleet sticking to his expensive haircut. "Name's Charles Wallingford. Chaz. I've taken the big house up the hill, Glenstrive Estate, for the festive season." "Aye?" Hamish said, managing to infuse the single syllable with profound disinterest. He knew Glenstrive. It was a draughty barn of a place usually owned by an absentee duke who only visited to shoot things. "Yes. Now look here, Constable, it's simply not good enough." Wallingford waved a thick, leather-gloved hand at the road. "I have guests arriving from London this afternoon. Important people. The road from Strathbane is an absolute disgrace. I nearly put this thing in a ditch twice. Where are the gritters? Where are the snowplows?" Hamish blinked slowly. A drop of icy water ran down his nose. "Well, Mr. Wallingford, it's snowing. It tends to make the roads slippery." Wallingford turned a shade of purple that clashed horribly with his tweed cap. "I know it's snowing, man. That's why I pay my taxes. I expect services. I expect the infrastructure to function. I didn't come up here to be trapped like a rat in a frozen wasteland." "Then you came to the wrong place," Hamish thought, but he merely sniffed. "The gritters will be out when they get to us, sir. Strathbane takes priority. We are a wee bit further down the list." Unacceptable. I shall be writing a letter to your chief constable. Blair, isn't it? I believe I met him at a dinner in Glasgow. Hamish felt a small flicker of internal sunshine at the mention of Detective Chief Inspector Blair. If Wallingford annoyed Blair, the man might have some redeeming qualities after all. Feel free, sir, though I suspect DCI Blair is busy with serious crimes in the city, like finding a donut shop open before 9 am, Hamish thought charitably. Wallingford glared at Hamish as if he were a particularly stubborn stain on a carpet. Well, since you're doing absolutely nothing, perhaps you can make yourself useful. My wife, Ophelia, is insisting on a traditional Highland Christmas Eve gathering tomorrow night, locals included. It seems we have to invite the village notables to make it authentic. He said the word locals the way one might say bacteria. How nice, Hamish lied. Yes, well, consider yourself invited, and the minister, and the doctor, and that woman who runs the hotel, what's her name? You can provide a bit of local colour, just try not to smell too much like sheep. Wallingford didn't wait for an answer. He spun on his expensive heel, marched back to his tank-like vehicle and roared off, spraying Hamish with slush a second time for good measure. Hamish watched the Range Rover disappear into the mist towards Glenstrive. He wiped the freezing mud from his coat with a sigh. His quest for milk had been interrupted, his trousers were wet, and he had just been invited to a party he would rather chew his own arm off than attend. A wealthy, arrogant outsider throwing his weight around, a house full of Londoners expecting an authentic experience in the middle of a blizzard, and lots of alcohol. Lugs, Hamish called out to the closed door of the cottage, his voice heavy with premonition. I have a nasty feeling that Santa isn't the only one coming to town this year, and the other fellow is carrying something much sharper than a sack of toys. Hamish finally secured his milk, though the journey to the stores had cost him the last of his dignity and a considerable amount of body heat. Mrs. Patel had been sympathetic, offering him a stale ginger nut with his change, while the village gossip, Mrs. Gillespie, had already heard about the English invasion at Glenstrive. By the time Hamish returned to his cottage, the sleet had turned into a steady, suffocating snow. He spent the remainder of the day in a state of strategic hibernation, ignoring the frantic ringing of the station telephone. He knew instinctively it was either a stranded motorist or Wallingford demanding a police escort for a grocery delivery. He answered neither. Christmas Eve arrived with the subtlety of a landslide. The wind had dropped, leaving Loch Dhu encased in a silence so profound it felt heavy. Hamish spent the afternoon grooming lugs and polishing his boots, a task he performed with the enthusiasm of a man preparing for his own execution. He had to attend the gathering at Glenstrive. The social hierarchy of the Highlands was a delicate web, and as the local constable, his absence would be noted by the county set and the villagers alike. He donned his best uniform, which felt increasingly tight around the middle, a testament to too many bowls of Mrs. Kennedy's mutton stew, and set off up the hill. Glenstrive estate was a Victorian monstrosity of turrets and cold stone, but tonight it was ablaze with light. As Hamish approached, he could hear the thrum of a generator and the discordant sounds of a jazz record competing with the Highland air. He entered the great hall and was immediately hit by a wall of artificial heat and the smell of expensive pine-scented candles. The room was filled with Wallingford's guests, slender women in silk dresses that were entirely inappropriate for the latitude, and men in velvet smoking jackets who looked as though they had never seen a day of physical labour in their lives. Charles Wallingford was in the centre of the room, looking even more ridiculous than he had the previous day. He had squeezed his portly frame into a fancy dress version of a kilt, the tartan a garish neon green that would have made a true clansman weep. He held a crystal tumbler of whisky in one hand and a silver-tipped walking stick in the other, acting the part of the benevolent laird. "Ah, the arm of the law!" Wallingford roared, his face already flushed with drink. "Come in, Macbeth. Try the punch. It's an old family recipe, mostly rum and enough spice to kill a horse. We're about to start the Grand Highland Hunt." Hamish accepted a glass of the punch, which smelled like a chemistry experiment.
"The Grand Highland Hunt, sir?"
Yes. I've hidden a treasure somewhere on the grounds. The guests have to find it using only these ridiculous old lanterns I bought in Inverness. Authentic, you see." Wallingford laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "I'm going to go hide the final clue myself. Nobody follow me. It's a surprise." Wallingford stumbled toward the heavy oak side door that led to the gardens and the old stone ice house. The guests cheered, their laughter brittle and forced. Hamish retreated to a corner, hoping to remain invisible. He watched the Sassenachs flutter about, complaining about the lack of signal and the charming dampness of the walls. Ophelia Wallingford, a brittle woman with hair the colour of a polished penny, hovered near the fireplace, looking anxious. An hour passed. The novelty of the hunt began to wear thin as the guests realised that the Highland night was significantly colder than the drawing room. One by one, they drifted back inside, shivering and empty-handed. "Where's Charles?" Ophelia asked, her voice thin. "He should have been back by now to announce the winner." Hamish felt a familiar cold knot in his stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. He set down his glass. "I'll go have a look, Mrs. Wallingford. He likely just got turned around in the dark." He stepped outside, lugs trotting at his heels. The snow was falling in large, lazy flakes. He followed the uneven tracks of Wallingford's boots toward the old ice house, a domed stone structure built into the hillside. The door was ajar. Inside, the air was crystalline and smelled of ancient damp. Hamish clicked on his torch. The beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the frost-covered walls. There, in the centre of the floor, sat the treasure, a large, silver-plated punch bowl. And draped over it, as if he had tried to drink his way to the bottom, was Charles Wallingford. He was face down in the frozen remains of the liquid, his novelty Santa hat floating like a red buoy. His green kilt was hiked up in a way that was profoundly undignified. Hamish knelt and checked the neck. Cold, very cold. He looked at the way the body was positioned. The angle of the head was all wrong. It looked as though he had tripped, but the floor was clear of obstacles. Then Hamish saw it, a small, delicate piece of fishing line tied across the entrance of the ice house, just high enough to catch a drunken man's boot. "Ruined," Hamish whispered to Lugs, who let out a soft whine. "My Christmas is officially ruined." He stood up, looking out at the lights of the house. He could already hear the sirens of the Strathbane police in his mind, and with them, the inevitable, screaming arrival of DCI Blair. The peace of Loch-Dhu hadn't just been broken, it had been murdered. Hamish stood in the freezing silence of the icehouse for a long moment, the beam of his torch illuminating the tragic absurdity of Charles Wallingford's final pose. The silver punch bowl, intended for a festive game, was now a macabre headstone. He didn't touch anything. Experience had taught him that the less he did, the fewer things DCI Blair could accuse him of ruining. Lugg sat by the doorway, his ears flattened against the cold, looking as if he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Hamish sighed, the sound a plume of white mist in the frigid air. He knew the protocol, but he also knew the reality of his life in the Highlands. This wasn't just a murder, it was a logistical nightmare that would bring the heavy-handed machinery of the Strathbane police down upon his quiet village. He stepped back outside, carefully avoiding the nearly invisible fishing line, and made his way back to the house to call it in. The guests were still huddled in the great hall, their voices rising in a frantic chorus of what's happened. "And where's Charles?" Hamish ignored them, heading straight for the telephone in the library to alert his superiors. When he finally got through to the Strathbane headquarters, the dispatcher's voice was weary, but as soon as the word homicide left Hamish's lips, the atmosphere changed. The machine was beginning to grind. 20 minutes later, the silence of Loch-Dhu was shattered by the banshee wail of sirens. 3 patrol cars and a black unmarked sedan crested the hill, their blue lights strobing against the whitewashed walls of the manor like a fever dream. Tires crunched on the gravel, and before the engines had even died, the doors flew open. DCI Blair exploded from the sedan, looking truly miserable. He was a squat, aggressive man with a face the colour of overboiled ham and a permanent expression of digestive distress. Behind him trailed his 2 sycophants, Detectives Anderson and McLean, who moved with a swagger that suggested they had just arrived to liberate a war zone rather than investigate a village tragedy. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the turrets. He marched across the lawn, his heavy boots destroying the pristine snow that Hamish had tried so hard to preserve. "You useless red-headed peasant. I was halfway through a steak when the call came. Why is there a corpse?" "Good evening, sir," Hamish said mildly, his hands buried deep in his greatcoat pockets. "The body is in the ice house. It's Mr. Wallingford. He's quite dead." "I'll be the judge of who's dead and who isn't," Blair snapped, shoving past Hamish. He stomped toward the ice house, Anderson and McLean flanking him like a pair of poorly dressed bodyguards. Hamish followed at a distance, watching as Blair burst into the stone structure and immediately tripped on the threshold, nearly falling onto the corpse. "Watch yourself, Sir Hamish," warned, his voice devoid of emotion. "There is a bit of fishing line across the door." Blair scrambled to his feet, his face turning an even more alarming shade of purple. He looked down at the thin filament of line that Hamish had pointed out. "Fishing line? You think this is some sort of poaching accident? Don't be ridiculous, Macbeth. Look at this room. Look at the bowl." The man obviously had a heart attack and fell into the punch. "It's a tragic accident brought on by gluttony and the Highland weather. Case closed. We'll get the meat wagon up here and be back in Strathbane by midnight. There is no mystery here for a simple village copper. He has a bruise on the back of his neck that doesn't fit a—" "Fall into a silver bowl, sir," Hamish noted quietly, staring at the floor, and the line was tied at exactly the height to catch a man's stride. "It's a trap, sir, not an accident." Blair's eyes narrowed into slits. He hated it when Hamish was right, but he hated it even more when Hamish tried to act like a real detective. He looked at the line, then at the body, and finally at the expensive guests watching from the windows. The scent of a high-profile case began to outweigh his hunger. "Of course it's a trap," Blair suddenly shouted, as if he had discovered it himself. "It's as plain as the nose on your ugly face. Anderson, McLean, get the tape up. Nobody leaves this house. This is a cold-blooded murder, and I'll bet my pension it was that wife of his. Or one of these shifty locals you're always protecting, Macbeth. You, stay out of the way. Go stand by a sheep or something. I'm taking over. I want every guest in that hall lined up for questioning. I am the boss." Hamish slipped away from the chaos of Glenstrive, while DCI Blair was busy shouting at a weeping fashion model in the Great Hall. Blair had told him to stand by a sheep, and Hamish was more than happy to comply, figuratively speaking. He whistled for Lugs, who emerged from behind a heavy velvet curtain looking deeply relieved to be leaving the aura of Blair's hostility. The snow was still falling, but the wind had died down to a conspiratorial whisper as Hamish trudged back down the hill toward the village. He knew that while Blair was currently bullying the city guests, the real story of Loch Dhu always resided in the kitchens and the quiet corners of the local shops. A man like Wallingford didn't just arrive and die. He left a trail of ruffled feathers and bruised egos like a fox in a henhouse. He headed first for the Tommel Castle Hotel. If there was a secret to be found, it usually surfaced in the steam of a kitchen or the bottom of a glass. Nellie, the proprietor, was in the kitchen, her face flushed, from the heat of the ovens and the stress of the Wallingford situation. She poured Hamish a cup of tea without him even asking, pushing a plate of shortbread toward him with a firm nod. "That man was a menace, Hamish," she said, leaning against the wooden counter. "Did you know he tried to buy the fishing rights to the entire stretch of the loch? Said he wanted to make it a private club for his London friends. Told the locals they'd have to pay a fee to cast a line in their own water." Hamish sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. "I heard a whisper of it, Nellie." "But did he actually do it?" "He was trying," she replied, her eyes narrowing. "He'd been sending threatening letters to everyone from here to Knothen. Even old Archie, who's fished that water since before the war. Archie was fit to be tied. Said he'd see Wallingford in the ground before he saw a no trespassing sign on the bank." Hamish moved on to Patel's general store. Mrs. Patel was sorting through a delivery of tinned haggis, her movements sharp and efficient. "He owed money, Hamish," she whispered, looking over her shoulder as if the ghost of Wallingford might be lurking by the biscuits. "He came in here last week, demanding I open a line of credit for his grand party supplies. When I told him we don't do credit for newcomers, he flew into a rage. Said his accountants were just restructuring, and that I should be honoured to serve a man of his stature. He was all fur coat and no knickers, as my mother used to say. I think the big house was just a front. He was broke as a Kirk mouse." Hamish nodded, filing the information away. A man with no money and a lot of enemies was a walking target. "Did he have any visitors, Mrs. Patel? Anyone not from the big house?" She paused, a tin of peas in mid-air. "There was a man, drove a grey sedan. Didn't look like a Londoner. Looked like a debt collector, if you ask me. They had a row right outside by the petrol pump. Finally, he encountered Mrs. Kennedy, the postmistress, near the postbox. She was a woman who treated other people's mail as her own personal library. A lot of legal letters, Hamish," she said, her voice a low, rhythmic croak. "Heavy envelopes from London solicitors. And one very strange package that arrived for him 2 days ago. It wasn't addressed to Charles, though. It was for the occupier, but it had a return address for a firm that specializes in private investigations. Why would a man on holiday need a private detective? Hamish leaned against a stone wall, watching the distant blue lights of the police cars up at Glenstrive. While Blair was currently accusing the grieving widow of being a black widow because she wasn't crying loudly enough, Hamish was looking at a much more complex picture: a man trying to steal local rights, a man drowning in debt, and a man who was perhaps being watched by the very people he had invited to his party. He felt the cold air biting at his ears. It wasn't just one motive, it was a buffet of grievances. Wallingford had managed to insult, threaten, or cheat everyone he had come into contact with since crossing the Highland border. But the fishing line, that was a local touch. A Londoner would have used a gun or a knife or some complicated poison. A Highland trap required a specific kind of patience and a knowledge of the terrain. Hamish finished his cold tea and looked at lugs. We need to talk to the notables, lugs, the ones Wallingford considered local colour. If I know the doctor and the minister, they saw more than they're letting on to Blair. He began walking back toward the lights of the hotel, his mind already piecing together the social dynamics of the upper class that might have led to a silver punch bowl becoming a coffin. He needed a sounding board, and there was only one person in Lochdu who truly understood the twisted motivations of the wealthy. It was time to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe. Hamish pushed through the heavy oak. Doors of the Tommel Castle Hotel, the warmth of the lobby hitting him like a physical blow. He stood on the mat for a moment, the snow on his shoulders beginning to weep into the thick carpet. He felt out of place in his salt-stained uniform, a ragged Highland policeman, among the polished brass and velvet of the hotel lounge. He spotted Priscilla Halberton Smythe sitting by the fire, looking effortlessly cool and entirely too beautiful for the grim business of the night. She was nursing a small sherry, her blonde hair catching the amber glow of the hearth. Priscilla was the daughter of the local gentry, a woman Hamish had loved with a quiet, hopeless persistence for years, though their relationship remained a tangled thicket of unspoken words and social barriers. As he approached, she looked up, her blue eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and that familiar, amused skepticism she reserved for the world's absurdities. "I heard the news, Hamish," she said, her voice a calm melody amidst the distant sounds of Blair's shouting echoed by the wind. "Nellie told me you found him. Poor Charles, though I suppose poor is hardly the right word for a man who spent his life trying to look richer than he actually was." Hamish sank into the armchair opposite her, his bones aching with a weariness that went deeper than the cold. He appreciated that she didn't ask him if he wanted a drink. She simply waited for him to find his own rhythm. "It's a mess, Priscilla. Blair is up there now, trying to pin it on the widow because she has better skin than he does. But it wasn't a crime of passion, or at least not the kind Blair understands. It was too precise." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low rumble. "Someone tied a fishing line across that icehouse door, a local trick but used by someone who knew exactly when Wallingford would be stumbling through the dark." Priscilla set her glass down with a delicate click. "You're looking for a motive in the mud, Hamish, but you should be looking in the bank books, or the lack of them. I knew Charles in London long before he decided to play the Highland Laird. He was what we call a professional guest. He survived on invitations, charm, and the occasional piece of information he shouldn't have had. The guests he brought up here weren't his friends, they were his creditors and his targets. Take Jeremy Thorne, for instance, the tall, athletic man who looks like he's posing for a country clothing catalogue. He's a fanatic about salmon fishing, and he's also a man with a very fragile reputation in the city. Charles was holding something over him, something to do with a failed merger last spring. Hamish watched her, mesmerised as always by the way she navigated the murky waters of the upper class. She understood the social dynamics that he only felt instinctively. "So, Wallingford was a blackmailer?" Hamish asked, the pieces beginning to shift in his mind. Priscilla nodded slowly, her expression darkening, in a very polite, very English way. "He didn't ask for cash, he asked for investments in his lifestyle. He forced people to endure his company and his whims. Jeremy Thorne was miserable the entire time he was here. I saw them arguing by the gun room yesterday. Jeremy was talking about traditions and fair play, and Charles was just laughing at him. It was a cruel kind of laughter, the sort that makes a man want to strike out." Hamish shifted in his seat, the heat of the fire making his damp trousers steam. A fisherman, he mused, thinking of the delicate tension required to tie a tripwire in the dark, and Thorn would know how to handle a line. But why the ice house? Why the silver punch bowl? Priscilla leaned in closer, the scent of her perfume, something light and floral, momentarily distracting Hamish from the scent of death. Because Charles loved a spectacle. He wanted the grand hunt to be his crowning achievement of the season. He told everyone he had a surprise that would change their lives. I suspect that surprise was the revelation of a new piece of leverage. He was going to announce something in that ice house, something that would have ruined Jeremy or one of the others. She reached out, her hand hovering near his arm but never quite touching. Be careful, Hamish. Blair is looking for an easier rest to get back to the city, but these people are dangerous because they have everything to lose. They don't fight like the locals, they destroy you from the inside. Hamish felt the familiar pang of affection mixed with the bitter realization that they lived in different worlds. She was warning him, protecting him in her own way, yet she remained part of the circle he was investigating. He stood up, his joints popping. I'm not worried about Blair, Priscilla. I'm worried about the person who stayed behind to make sure Charles didn't get up. If Thorn is my man, he's a man who knows how to wait for the catch. He looked at her one last time, a silent thank you in his eyes that she acknowledged with a small, sad smile. As he walked back out into the night, the Highland air felt even sharper. He knew he had the key now, but he also knew that proving it to a man like Blair would be like trying to teach a bull to dance. He needed more than just a motive. He needed a slip-up. He needed to find out what had happened to that missing item of clothing Mrs. Kennedy hadn't mentioned, or perhaps a lie about a pet that didn't exist. He turned toward the dark silhouette of the stables, the snow muffling his footsteps as he prepared to step into the Red Herring's path. The climb back to Glenstrive was a penance that Hamish Macbeth felt he had done nothing to deserve. The wind had picked up again, whipping the heavy snow into stinging needles that sought out every gap in his greatcoat. Lugs was no longer trotting. He was huddled against Hamish's shins, his tail a frozen rudder. When they finally reached the heavy oak doors of the manor, the scene inside was even more turbulent than the storm outside. The great hall was filled with the sharp, acrid scent of police-issue cigarettes and the metallic tang of fear. DCI Blair was in the centre of the room, his chest puffed out so far that the buttons on his waistcoat looked ready to surrender. He was holding a pair of handcuffs, and standing before him, looking like a bewildered tortoise, was old Archie McLean. The elderly fisherman was still wearing his tattered oilskins, his face a roadmap of broken veins and Highland history. He looked small and fragile under the glare of the electric chandeliers. Caught him red-handed, Macbeth, Blair roared, his voice bouncing off the high rafters. I told you it was a local. Resentment, pure and simple. We found the evidence in his miserable little hut by the harbour, a spool of the exact same fishing line used to trip the deceased. He's confessed to hating Wallingford, and that's enough for me. We're taking him down to Strathbane tonight. Archie looked at Hamish, his milky eyes pleading. I only said I'd like to see him in the loch, Hamish. I didn't mean I'd put him there. And the line. Every man in the village has a spool of that stuff. It's the only thing that holds against the rocks. Blair sneered, shoving Archie toward the waiting Anderson. Save it for the magistrate, you old poacher. You're a relic, and you've killed a man of status. It's an open and shut case. Hamish didn't move. He stood by the doorway, a tall, silent figure in a dripping coat. He looked at Archie, then at the floor, then at the boots Archie was wearing. They were old, cracked leather things held together by hope and several layers of grease. Then he looked at the expensive guests who were watching the arrest with a mixture of horror and poorly concealed relief. It's a fine bit of work, sir, Hamish said, his voice dropping into that slow, rhythmic drawl that always made Blair think he was dealing with a simpleton. A very fine bit of work. Indeed. It takes a real detective to find the obvious suspect in less than 2 hours. It's a pity about the snow, though. Blair froze, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. What about the snow, you long-legged streak of misery? Well, sir, Hamish continued, leaning lazily against a suit of armour, Archie here has been at the hotel since 5 o'clock. Nellie saw him, and the minister saw him. He didn't leave until the sirens started. Now, the ice house is a good half-mile walk through the drifts. If Archie had gone up there to set that trap, and then gone back to the village, his boots would be soaked through to the wool. But look at them, sir. They're bone dry on the inside. He's been sitting by Nellie's fire all night, and there's the matter of his hands. Hamish walked over and gently lifted Archie's gnarled, trembling hands. The knot on that fishing line was a bimini twist. It's a very complicated knot, sir. Requires a lot of dexterity. Archie's fingers are so riddled with the rheumatism that he can barely hold a fork, let alone tie a high-tech lure knot in the dark with a blizzard blowing down his neck. Blair's mouth opened and closed like a landed fish. He looked at Archie's hands, then at the dry boots, then back at Hamish. The silence in the hall was deafening. The guests shifted uncomfortably. "It's a red herring, sir," Hamish added softly. "Someone wanted you to find Archie. Someone knew about the fishing rights dispute and planted that spool in his hut. They even chose the line Archie uses, but they forgot one thing. Archie hasn't been able to tie that specific knot in 10 years. The killer is someone with young, strong hands, and someone who knows that the Sea Ghost brand of line is what the locals prefer, even if they buy a more expensive version for themselves." Blair snatched his hands away from Archie, his embarrassment quickly curdling into a fresh batch of rage. "Fine. So it's not the old man. Anderson, let him go. But don't think. This makes you a hero, Macbeth. You've just slowed us down. If it wasn't the local, it's one of these Londoners. And I'll have the truth out of them if I have to keep them here until Hogmanay." Hamish watched as Archie was released, the old man scurrying toward the door without a second glance. Hamish's eyes drifted back to the crowd of guests. Jeremy Thorne was standing near the back, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, but it was the woman. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of unsaid things. Hamish realized then that the motive wasn't the looming financial ruin or the stolen fishing rights. Those were just the background noise of Wallingford's life. The real reason he was dead was because he had intended to turn a private tragedy into a public spectacle for his own amusement. He was a man who traded in shame, and someone had decided that the price of that shame was too high to pay. The killer wasn't a master criminal. They were a cornered animal. And as Hamish looked at the quiet woman before him, he saw the spark of a hunter in her eyes. It wasn't just Thorne who knew how to tie a bimini twist. Any woman who had spent her youth on the salmon rivers of the Spey or the Tay would have the same skill. The silver button wasn't a clue left by a man in a hurry. It was a fragment of a woman's calculated rage. The motive was as old as the hills, the preservation of one's own life against a bully who would finally truly stop. Hamish set his mug down with a deliberate slow click that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the kitchen. He looked at Penelope Vane, who was still clutching the plate of scones as if it were a shield against the truth. He didn't accuse her. That wasn't the Highland way, and it certainly wasn't the Macbeth way. Instead, he gave her a wide, slightly gormless smile that made his eyes look as vacant as a summer sky. "It's a terrible business, surely," he said, scratching his red hair, "and DCI Blair is that convinced he's found the answer in a spool of string. But he's a city man, you see. He doesn't realise that in the Highlands we notice the little things, like how a silver bowl isn't always just a bowl." He saw the minute tightening of her jaw, the way her gaze flickered toward the door leading back to the hall. "What do you mean, Constable?" she asked, her voice steady but perhaps a fraction too thin. Hamish leaned in, smelling of peat smoke and damp wool. "Just a bit of local curiosity. When I was looking at that punch bowl in the ice house before the chief inspector arrived to trample the evidence, I noticed the weight of it was all wrong. It had a double bottom, I'd wager. And something was rattling inside. Sounded like a small notebook, or maybe a set of keys to a safe deposit box. Wallingford was a man who kept receipts, wasn't he? He didn't wait for her to answer. He whistled for lugs and lumbered out of the kitchen, his boots clattering loudly on the stone flags. He needed the rumour to spread, and in a house full of panicked socialites, a rumour was faster than a radio signal. He entered the Great Hall, where DCI Blair was currently threatening to arrest the caterers for suspiciously light vol au vents. Hamish walked right up to the red-faced inspector, making sure he was within earshot of Jeremy Thorne and the lingering guests. "Excuse me, sir," Hamish said, pitching his voice just loud enough to carry across the room. "About that silver bowl in the ice house. I've locked the door, but I'm worried about the item hidden in the base. If that contains the names of the people Wallingford was, well, investing with, it might be the key to the whole case. Should I bring it in now, or wait for the forensics team from Inverness to open the secret compartment?" Blair spun around, his eyes bulging. "Secret compartment? What are you bleating about, Macbeth? I didn't see any secret compartment." "Oh, it's very subtle, sir," Hamish lied smoothly, looking like the very image of a helpful, dim-witted subordinate. "You have to twist the rim in a certain way. I didn't want to touch it further in case I smudged the killer's fingerprints. But if the killer knows it's there, they might try to get to it before the specialists arrive at dawn. I thought I'd stay out here by the fire and keep an eye on the door, but my legs are that tired from the snow." Blair let out a derisive snort. "You're exhausted? I've been running this investigation while you've been mooching tea. Get out of my sight, Macbeth. Go find a sofa in the library and sleep. I'll have Anderson and McLean watch the house. Nobody is getting near that ice house. I'll open the secret compartment myself when I'm good and ready." "If you say so, sir," Hamish said, bowing his head in mock submission. He made a grand show of yawning and shuffling toward the library, Lugs following with a sceptical wag of his tail. He knew Blair wouldn't actually guard the ice house. The man was already eyeing the decanter of brandy on the sideboard and complaining about the draft. Blair would tell his detectives to watch the perimeter, which usually meant they would sit in the warm patrol car and listen to the football scores on the radio. The trap was set. By mentioning a hidden ledger or a notebook, Hamish had given the killer a reason to return to the scene of the crime. If the motive was the suppression of a scandal, the killer couldn't risk the police finding Wallingford's insurance policy. They would have to retrieve it, and they would have to do it now under the cover of the blizzard, before the real experts arrived to dismantle the silver bowl. Hamish didn't go to the library. He slipped out of a side window in the gun room, dropping silently into the soft, deep snow. The cold hit him like a physical blow, but he welcomed it. It cleared his head. He circled the manor until he reached the shadows of the nearby bushes. The Highland night was no longer merely a weather event, it had become a personal adversary. Hamish Macbeth crouched behind a cluster of frozen rhododendrons, his knees cracking in a way that suggested they might never straighten again. The snow was piling up against his back like a cold, heavy shroud, and Lugs was currently tucked into the front of Hamish's greatcoat, a warm, vibrating lump of canine indignation. The ice house stood 30 yards away, a dark, humped shape in the gloom that resembled some ancient, sleeping beast. Hamish's eyes were watering from the sting of the sleet, but he kept them fixed on the heavy wooden door. He had gambled his reputation and his warm bed on the hope that greed and fear were more powerful than the desire for a good night's sleep. He didn't have to wait long. A figure emerged from the side of the manor, moving with a surprising fluidity despite the deep drifts. It wasn't the heavy, stumbling gait of a man like Jeremy Thorne, nor the frantic scuttle of a frightened servant. This was a person who moved with the quiet, predatory grace of a hill fox. The figure was draped in a dark, waterproof cape that billowed in the wind, and they carried a small, shrouded lantern. Hamish watched as the light flickered briefly, a pale, ghost-like eye in the storm, before the person reached the icehouse door. The iron hinges gave a low, tortured groan as they were pushed open, and the figure vanished inside. Hamish waited a heartbeat, then two, before he began his own silent approach. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man who had poached half the salmon in the Strathbane district, his boots finding the firm ground beneath the snow with unerring accuracy. When he reached the threshold of the icehouse, the air inside felt strangely still, shielded from the howling gale. The lantern was sitting on the floor, casting long, distorted shadows up the curved stone walls. Penelope Vane was kneeling beside the silver punch bowl, her delicate fingers frantic as she searched the underside of the rim. She was breathing hard, the sound of it rasping in the small space. She wasn't the quiet, helpful social secretary anymore. Her face, caught in the low light, was a mask of cold, calculating desperation. She was muttering to herself, a string of whispered curses that would have made a Glasgow docker blush. She was looking for the secret compartment that didn't exist, her hands clawing at the polished metal as if she could force the silver to yield its non-existent secrets. "It's a very clever bit of craftsmanship, isn't it?" Hamish said softly, leaning his shoulder against the doorframe. Penelope didn't scream. She froze, her entire body locking into a position of rigid terror. Slowly she turned her head to look at him, her eyes wide and reflecting the orange flicker of the lantern. "Constable," she whispered, her voice devoid of its earlier clerical softness. "You're supposed to be in the library. You're supposed to be asleep." I'm supposed to be a lot of things," Hamish replied. stepping fully into the room. Luggs hopped out of his coat and took up a position by the door, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. I'm supposed to be lazy, and I'm supposed to be stupid enough to believe that Archie MacLean could tie a bimini twist with fingers as stiff as frozen kelp. But the thing about being a village copper, Miss Vane, is that you have a lot of time to think. And what I thought was that a woman like you, someone who has spent her life being invisible, would eventually get tired of watching men like Charles Wallingford trample over everyone's lives. You didn't kill him for the money, did you? And you didn't kill him for Jeremy Thorne's reputation. You killed him because he'd finally found something on you, something you couldn't allow to come out. Penelope stood up slowly, her hands hidden in the folds of her cape. The air in the ice house seemed to drop several degrees. Charles was a parasite, she said, her voice now hard and brittle as ice. He found out about my brother, about the debt he ran up in London and the way I adjusted the accounts to cover for him. Charles was going to tell everyone tonight. He was going to make a joke of it. He enjoyed the idea of the perfect Miss Vane being a common thief. I couldn't let him do it, Constable. I've worked too hard for my life. So you set the trap, Hamish said, his eyes never leaving her hands. You knew he'd be drunk, and you knew he'd be first to the ice house for his grand reveal. You tied the line, and you waited. And when he fell and hit his head on the bowl, you didn't call for help. You made sure he stayed down. It was neat, efficient. Just like your filing system. Penelope's expression shifted, the desperation turning into a cold, sharp resolve. You're a clever man, Macbeth. Too clever for this little village. It's a pity. If you'd stayed in the library, I could have been gone by morning. But now you've made it personal. Her hand whipped out from beneath the cape, and Hamish saw the glint of a heavy, iron hearth poker she had scavenged from the gun-room. She didn't hesitate. She lunged at him with the strength born of pure, unadulterated panic. Hamish moved with a speed that would have shocked DCI Blair. He didn't retreat. He stepped into her arc, his large hand catching her wrist before the iron could connect with his skull. She was surprisingly strong, her body wiry and fueled by the adrenaline of a cornered predator. They grappled in the center of the ice house, their shadows dancing wildly on the walls. Penelope clawed at his face, her nails drawing blood, but Hamish didn't let go. He used his weight to pin her against the cold stone wall, the silver punch bowl clattering across the floor between them. He felt a sharp pain in his leg as she kicked out, her heavy boots finding his shin, but he merely gritted his teeth and increased the pressure on her arm until the poker fell from her nerveless fingers. That's enough, Penelope, he gasped, his breath hitching in his chest. It's over. The game is finished. She collapsed then, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had arrived. She slumped against him, sobbing not with regret, but with the hollow sound of a woman who had lost everything. Hamish held her there for a moment, not out of comfort, but out of a grim necessity. He felt the cold seeping through his boots, the silence of the Highland night pressing in on them. He had his killer, but there was no joy in it. It was just another sad story in a land that had seen too many of them. Outside, the sound of a whistle pierced the wind. DCI Blair had finally realized his constable was missing and had come looking for someone to shout at. The blue lights of the patrol cars began to sweep across the snowy hillside once more, reflecting off the icehouse walls. Hamish looked down at Penelope, who was now staring blankly at the silver bowl. You should have just gone to the police, he said quietly. Blair is an idiot, but the law is the law. The law doesn't protect people like me, Macbeth, she whispered. It only protects people like Charles. Hamish didn't answer. He picked up the poker, whistled for Luggs, and led her out into the freezing wind to meet the shouting, red-faced man who would take all the credit for a case he had nearly ruined. As they walked toward the lights of the manor, Hamish felt the exhaustion finally settling into his marrow. He had solved the mystery, but the real work, the work of making sure he wasn't promoted away from his beloved Lochdu, was only just beginning. He needed to find a way to make this look like a brilliant piece of DCI Blair-esque intuition, and he needed to do it before the milk in his fridge turned sour. The confrontation was over, but the deception was just starting. Blair's silhouette crested the white rise of the hill, his heavy breath visible even in the dark, a frantic plume of steam. Behind him, the torches of Anderson and MacLean flickered like dying stars, casting long, jittery shadows across the drifts. "Macbeth!" the DCI screamed, his voice cracking against the wind. "I told you to stay in the library!" If you've contaminated my crime scene again, I'll have your badge and your scruffy dog's tail for breakfast." Hamish stood by the entrance of the ice house, his hand firmly but gently on Penelope Vane's shoulder. She had stopped weeping and was now merely a hollow shell, staring at the snow with a vacant, terrifying intensity. "I'm sorry, sir," Hamish shouted back, his voice thick with a fake tremor of anxiety. I was looking for Lugs. He ran off, and I followed his tracks, and then I saw a light. I thought it was a ghost, sir. The ghost of Glenstreve. I nearly fainted from the fright." Blair reached the threshold, sliding the last few feet on a patch of black ice. He regained his balance by grabbing a stone pillar, his face inches from Hamish's. "Ghosts? You're a disgrace to the uniform. What is this woman doing here? And what's that iron in your hand?" Hamish looked down at the poker as if he'd only just noticed it. "Oh, this. I found it on the floor, sir. Miss Vane here. Well, she was acting very strange. I think she was looking for that secret compartment I mentioned. But I told her, I said, 'Miss Vane, only a brilliant mind like DCI Blair could find the truth in a silver bowl.' I think my words just overwhelmed her, sir. She started confessing all sorts of things about London, accounting, and fishing lines. I couldn't make head or tail of it. It was far too complex for a man of my limited education. I'm just glad you arrived when you did." Blair's eyes narrowed, then widened as the implications sank into his thick skull. He looked at Penelope, who remained silent, and then at the silver bowl on the floor. Confessing, was she? About the accounting? And the tripwire? He puffed out his chest, the transition from rage to self-congratulation happening with dizzying speed. Of course she was. She realized I was on to her. I saw the way she was twitching in the Great Hall. My interrogation techniques are designed to break even the most hardened criminals. She knew I'd find that secret compartment eventually. I've always said, Macbeth, that the criminal always returns to the scene of the crime when they know a master is on their heels. My presence here forced her hand. "That's exactly what I thought you'd say, sir," Hamish said, looking down. At his boots, with a humble nod. "You've got a real instinct for the criminal mind. It's a marvel to watch. I was just holding her here until you arrived to make the official arrest. I didn't want to overstep my bounds. I'm just a village constable after all. I wouldn't know how to fill out the paperwork for a high-profile homicide like this. It would take me a month just to find the right pen. You're the only one who can handle the big city legalities of a London murder." Blair laughed, a sharp barking sound of triumph. "Paperwork? You? Don't be ridiculous. You'd probably try to write it in Gaelic. No, I'll handle the arrest. Anderson, McLean, get the cuffs on her. This is a red-letter day for the Strathbane CID, a cold-blooded killer caught in the act of tampering with evidence. The papers will love the accounting for murder angle. I'll be sure to mention that I directed the search of the outbuildings. You, Macbeth, can go and find some more tea. Try not to trip over your own feet on the way back down. You're finished." As Penelope was led away through the snow toward the waiting police cars, she didn't look back. She went quietly, her spirit broken by the weight of the secrets she had tried so hard to protect. Blair followed behind her, already barking into his radio about a coordinated sting he had orchestrated to lure the killer back. He didn't thank Hamish. He didn't even acknowledge him. Hamish watched the taillights fade into the blizzard, the blue strobes replaced by the steady red of the receding vehicles. The silence of Loch Dhu returned, deeper and more profound. He felt the cold in his joints, but there was satisfaction. Blair would get a commendation, which meant he would be far too busy in Strathbane to bother with him again. Hamish walked back to his cottage, the snow muffling his steps. The village was safe and finally peaceful tonight. The sun climbed over the peaks of Sullivan the following morning, turning the snow-covered village of Loch Dhu into a glittering, silent postcard. The air was so cold it felt brittle, but the wind had finally retreated, exhausted by its own fury. Inside the police station, Hamish Macbeth was engaged in his favourite post-investigation ritual, the slow, methodical preparation of a proper breakfast. The smell of frying bacon and old-fashioned porridge filled the small room, providing a stark contrast to the sterile, metallic scent of the Glenstrive icehouse. Lugs was stretched out on the rag rug, his paws twitching as he chased dream rabbits in his sleep. The events of the previous night already felt like a fever dream, or a particularly unpleasant chapter in a book Hamish had finished and put back on the shelf. The door creaked open, admitting a blast of freezing air and Priscilla Halbert and Smythe. She was dressed in a thick cream-coloured wool sweater and and moleskin trousers, looking like the very essence of Highland elegance. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply sat at the small wooden table and watched as Hamish flipped a piece of black pudding in the pan. "I see the hero is back to his domestic duties," she said, her voice carrying that subtle edge of irony that always kept Hamish on his toes. Hamish didn't look up. "I'm no hero, Priscilla. Just a man who likes his eggs over easy and his village quiet. Blair is the hero today. Have you seen the papers?" He gestured toward the wireless on the sideboard, which was currently broadcasting a news bulletin from the city. DCI Blair's voice, sounding remarkably smug, was explaining how his relentless tactical pressure and keen understanding of the criminal psyche had led to the swift arrest of Penelope Vane. He had mentioned a brilliant sting operation involving a silver bowl, and how he had personally cornered the killer in a blizzard. There was no mention of a red-headed constable or a ginger dog. Priscilla smiled, a small knowing expression. The secret compartment, Hamish? Really? That was a bit bold even for you. I checked that punch bowl when they were loading it into the evidence van. It was solid silver, no compartment, no hidden ledger, and certainly no list of names. You lied to a senior officer. I didn't lie, Hamish said mildly, sliding a plate of food onto the table for her. I merely suggested a possibility. If the killer believed it, that's hardly my fault. It's a psychological tool, Priscilla, not a lie. It was a trap, she corrected him, picking up a fork. A trap designed to make the killer panic. And it worked beautifully. Penelope couldn't risk leaving that bowl behind if she thought it contained proof of her brother's embezzlement. You played on her only weakness, her loyalty to her family. Hamish sat down with his own plate, the warmth of the stove at his back. It's a sad thing when loyalty leads to murder. She was a good woman, in her own way. But Wallingford was the kind of man who turned goodness into a weapon. He wouldn't have stopped until she was in the gutter. They ate in silence for a while, the only sound the ticking of the clock, and the distant cry of a gull over the loch. The peace was broken by the sharp, demanding ring of the station telephone. Hamish sighed, looking at the receiver as if it were a poisonous snake. "Aren't you going to answer it?" Priscilla asked. "It'll be the chief constable," Hamish grunted. "He'll want to thank me for assisting Blair, and then he'll start talking about my potential. He'll mention a detective's course in Glasgow or a transfer to the drug squad in Inverness. He thinks he's doing me a favour." He picked up the phone. "Lochdu Police. Oh, hello, sir." "Yes, sir. A very successful night for the DCI. Me? Oh, no, sir. I was mostly just holding the torch. My feet were that cold I could barely think. A promotion? Oh, no, sir. I'm far too slow for the city. I'd get lost in a one-way street, I would. Sides. Who would look after the sheep? They've grown quite fond of my uniform." Hamish listened. For a moment more, nodding at empty air before hanging up. He looked relieved. "He thinks I'm a complete idiot, Priscilla. He told me to stay in the village and try not to get my boots wet. I think I've successfully sabotaged my career for another year." Priscilla laughed, a bright, clear sound that filled the room. "You're a terrible policeman, Hamish Macbeth, and a brilliant detective. It's a pity the world only sees the first part." "It's not a pity at all," Hamish said, standing up to clear the plates. "It's a blessing. I have my dog, I have my cottage, and I have the best view in the world. And if people think I'm a lazy Highlander, then they leave me in peace to enjoy it." He walked to the window and looked out at the loch. The water was a deep, bruised blue, and the mountains were white against the pale sky. The village was returning to its slow, rhythmic life. Mrs. Patel was opening her shop, and Archie McLean was already down by the harbour, checking his nets and likely telling everyone who would listen how he'd personally seen off the London police. Hamish turned back to the room. The fire was crackling, and the kettle was beginning to sing. The murder at Glenstrive was over, the outsider was gone, and the darkness had been pushed back into the shadows where it belonged. He picked up his coffee mug and sat back down by the stove, Lugs resting his chin on his knee. "Merry Christmas, Priscilla," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, Hamish," she replied, her eyes softening as she looked at him. The village of Lochdu remained as it always was, ancient, beautiful, and full of secrets that only a man who knew how to sit quietly and listen would ever truly understand.